In the early morning hours of Saturday, March 29, 1997, a blonde 26-year-old waitress named Kim Medlin carried a tray of filet mignon through a topless bar in Charlotte, North Carolina, while wearing a leotard and tights. She made her way through the cigar smoke-filled room, past the stage where all the half-naked women were busy pole dancing. Kim worked here at the men's club 3 or 4 nights a week, and for the most part, she liked the job. It paid well, and by working the night shift, it left her days free, so she could focus on her 2 real passions, which were taking care of her horses and decorating her brand new house. So Kim and her husband Bridger had recently bought a 7-acre plot of land outside the nearby town of Monroe, where Bridger had actually grown up. They'd spent the past year building their dream home, including a barn for their 3 horses, and now that the construction was done, they had finally started moving in and decorating. Now, as Kim delivered the filet mignons to a table of middle-aged businessmen, she glanced over at the clock on the wall, and she felt a surge of excitement when she saw that there was less than an hour left in her shift. Kim had the next 3 days off, and she planned to use all that free time to finish some of the smaller moving projects that still needed to get done, like just unpacking boxes and hanging some pictures. So she flashed the businessmen a smile and then went to check on her other tables. An hour later, a little after 2 a.m., Kim walked out the back entrance of the bar, now wearing a baggy sweatshirt instead of her work uniform, and she called out a goodbye over her shoulder to some coworkers, and then walked over to where her red Jeep was parked along the side of the building. She got in, dropped her purse onto the cow print seat cover on the passenger seat, turned on the car, and then turned on some music for the hour-long drive home. A half an hour later, Kim drove south down Old Charlotte Highway, a secluded 2-lane road that was pretty much deserted at this hour. She used to find this commute kind of relaxing, but lately, it had been making her nervous to be driving alone late at night. And the reason for that was because a couple of weeks ago, while she was driving home from work around this same time of night, she'd been involved in a really scary road rage incident. Another vehicle had come up from behind and started tailgating her and honking their horn at her repeatedly for really no apparent reason. Kim had been afraid that this was a customer from the men's club who was now following her home, and it freaked her out so much that she'd actually pulled over into a convenience store parking lot because she saw there was a police car parked in there as well, and so she'd gone right over to the officer to ask for help. He'd promised to go and try and track down this road rager, and he'd even sent out a broadcast over the police radio, telling all the other officers to keep an eye out for Kim's car on the night she was working in case anyone gave her more trouble. And so now, even though, that road rager had never been caught, Kim did feel better knowing that the police had her back. But again, because the road rager had not been caught, she was still a bit scared about driving home alone. So tonight, to calm her nerves, she fished out her cell phone out of her purse and just called her husband, Bridger. When he answered, he told her that he was actually on the road too. He was still driving back from a gig DJing at a prom in a town 2 hours away, but he was almost home. After chatting for a few minutes, Bridger told Kim that he was actually pulling into their driveway and that he would call her right back once he got inside the house. So Kim said fine and said goodbye, and they hung up, and she kept on driving. Then, about 15 minutes later, so a little before 3 a.m., her phone rang, and it was Bridger again, calling back like he had promised he would. And he asked Kim if she was close, and she told him that she was just passing by Union Station Restaurant, which meant she was maybe about 20 minutes away from home. Bridger said he was pretty tired and he was getting ready for bed, and in case he was asleep by the time she got in, he wished her goodnight. And Kim said goodnight back, and then she hung up, and she put her phone down on the passenger seat. But just as Kim turned her attention back towards the road, a sudden bright light almost blinded her. She looked in the rearview mirror and saw headlights right behind her. About an hour later, Kim's husband Bridger sat up in bed and looked over at the clock on his nightstand. It was 3:59 a.m., an hour after having spoken to Kim. I mean, she should have been home 20 minutes after that phone call, and she still wasn't back. So he got out of bed and he checked every room in their 2-story house, but Kim wasn't in any of them. There was no sign of her. Then Bridger looked out the window and he saw her Jeep wasn't in the driveway either. So at this point, he hurried into the kitchen and he picked up the phone and he dialed Kim's cell phone number. And it rang a few times, and then a strange male voice answered. Bridger asked who he was speaking to, and the man told him he was a police officer with the Monroe Public Safety Department. Bridger asked him, okay, well, where's my wife? And the officer told him that he didn't know. He had just come across a red Jeep idling on the side of the road and found this phone inside of it, and it was ringing, and so he answered it. But he said, "There's nobody here." Several minutes later, so this is a little bit after 4 a.m. on March 29, 1997, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk, a police investigator with the Monroe Public Safety Department, drove north along Old Charlotte Highway. He drove his patrol car past parking lots and houses until he reached the very edge of town. And finally, he saw what he was looking for: a red Jeep parked along the opposite side of the road, with another patrol car parked right behind it. He pulled a U-turn and parked on the shoulder, and as he got out of his car, he recognized Captain David Simpson standing there, waiting for him. Simpson told Chief Hulk that he had just found this Jeep idling on the side of the road about 15 minutes ago with its headlights on, and he had walked up. There had been nobody inside of it. But when he looked in, there was a cell phone, and it began to ring. And so, acting on instinct, he answered the phone, and it was a man named Bridger Medlin who was calling saying, "I'm looking for my wife. This is her phone. She hasn't come home." And Captain Simpson also said that he actually recognized this Jeep from a random run-in he had had 2 weeks earlier outside of a convenience store with Kim Medlin. And so he put it together and he's like, okay, Bridger's calling. This is definitely Kim's car, but Kim's nowhere to be found. And Hulk actually recognized Kim's name because he actually happened to be friends with Kim's husband, Bridger. And so he pulled out his flashlight and he began looking inside the Jeep, and right away he saw there was a wallet lying open on the passenger seat. And when he looked inside the wallet, there were credit cards, there was cash, but there was like this clear section of the wallet where obviously you would slide your driver's license, and there was nothing there. So it very much looked like her license had been pulled out on purpose. Now, their initial theory was, okay, well, maybe Kim got pulled over by a police officer and took out her license to hand to the cop. But in a department as small as Monroe's, there were only a few officers on duty at this time of night. And when Assistant Chief Hulk asked Captain Simpson, had any of the on-duty officers pulled anybody over that night, Simpson was already all over it. He had checked. And he said, no, none of our officers pulled anybody over. So this made Hulk wonder if maybe Kim had been pulled over by somebody posing as a cop. There had actually been dozens of reports over the years of so-called blue light bandits pretending to be police officers in order to harass drivers, especially young women. But those cases were really quite rare, even though they did happen, so Hulk didn't want to jump to any conclusions quite yet. Just then, Hulk heard a truck engine and saw headlights approaching up the highway. So he set the wallet back down on the seat and then walked over to where a black pickup truck was now pulling to a stop right behind Hulk's car. A tall man with blonde hair got out of the driver's seat, and right away Hulk knew who it was. It was his friend and Kim's husband, Bridger. And Bridger looked frantic, and he demanded to know what had happened to his wife. But Hulk told him to calm down, that they were here to try to figure out what happened to his wife and where she went. Hulk went on to say that, look, we showed up and we just found her car here. But there were no broken windows or slashed tires or any sign of a struggle, so it was possible that maybe Kim just ran into car trouble and maybe she went out to go find help. But then, without asking for permission, Bridger pushed past Hulk and just climbed right inside of the Jeep's driver's seat and said, well, let's test your theory right now and see whether the car was working. Hulk told him to get out of the Jeep, but Bridger just totally ignored him, and then he put his wife's car in drive and moved it forward a few inches. Then he put it in reverse, and he drove it backward, ultimately parking it in its original place, showing that it worked just fine. And even though at this point Hulk was kind of annoyed with Bridger for what he had just done, he couldn't help but think, this is bad, something's going on here. And so Hulk walked over to his car, and he radioed the dispatcher for reinforcements. And he asked them to bring a police dog so they could try to track Kim's scent in case she left on foot. A few minutes later, 2 more police cars pulled up to the scene, and a few officers and a police dog got out. Hulk opened the doors to the Jeep, and the dog went in and sniffed around, getting familiar with the scent of Kim's belongings. Then the dog seemed to pick up a trail on the ground, and so the officers told Bridger, who clearly wanted to go with them, to stay put, stay with your truck, and then they followed the dog down the road for about 100 yards or so until it turned onto a driveway. Hulk and the others followed the dog up this long driveway towards a small house nestled in the trees right off the highway, and the dog sniffed all the way up to the garage and then stopped. That was where Kim's trail ended. And so Hulk went up to the house and rang the doorbell, and a minute later, a man answered. And despite the late hour, he looked totally awake and not particularly surprised to see cops at his door. Hulk asked the man who he was and whether or not he had seen or heard anything unusual in the past couple of hours near his property. The man said his name was Nathan Hargett, and about an hour ago, so maybe around 3:45 a.m., he'd been woken up by a strange car loitering near his garage. Nathan said he hadn't recognized the car, but he noticed that it had Texas plates, and that there also had been a woman with blonde hair in the back seat. Hulk asked Nathan for permission to search his property, and Nathan told them to go right ahead. And so Hulk directed the other officers to search the inside of the house, while he clicked on his flashlight and headed over to the garage. When he got there, he turned the handle of a door on the side of the garage, and he found it was unlocked. So he pushed the door open, and he shined his flashlight inside, but all he saw was a truck and some gardening tools. There was no sign of Kim. By the time dawn broke around 6 a.m. that morning, this had become officially a missing persons case. So police began a search of the woods around the Old Charlotte Highway with help from members of the community. Meanwhile, Hulk and Simpson went back to the station to speak to one of the dispatchers who had been on duty that night. After speaking to that homeowner, Nathan, and searching his house and his garage, he had been ruled out as a suspect. So now they were focused on finding that car with the Texas plates that Nathan had seen loitering outside of his garage. So they were hoping that maybe there was a report of a traffic stop or maybe a suspicious car in the area or anything that might help figure out who was driving that car. But the dispatcher said again that really there had been no stops, nothing that night. However, there had been one incident in the area that night. It was around 2 a.m., so it was about an hour before Kim was last heard from. They'd gotten a call about a car that had run into a ditch not too far from where Kim's Jeep was found. Hulk asked who had responded to that call, and the dispatcher said it was car 491, which was driven by a young rookie officer named Josh Griffin. Hulk immediately gave Officer Griffin a phone call and asked if he had seen or heard anything unusual while he was out responding to that car in the ditch. But Griffin said no. He actually said that his shift was over around the time that driver had flagged him down for help, so he had actually just called for a tow truck, and when it got there, maybe a little bit after 2:30 a.m., Griffin said he just went home. Hulk hung up the phone feeling pretty disappointed. Bridger said the last time he heard from his wife Kim was around 3 a.m., so if this car was already being towed away by 2:30 a.m., then it definitely was not the same car that Nathan saw loitering outside of his garage, and the driver of that car in the ditch was likely not a suspect. Hulk sighed in frustration, but then another idea occurred to him. He asked Captain Simpson to elaborate on that random run-in he had had with Kim a couple of weeks earlier. Now, this was sort of a long shot to bring it up again, but Hulk wondered if maybe the same driver from the road rage incident could have maybe come back and, maybe chased Kim off the road or something. Simpson said he would go dig up the report that he had filed on the incident, and then he left to go find it. About half an hour later, Hulk sat at his desk reading through a copy of the road rage police report. It said that in the very early morning hours of Saturday, March 15th, so exactly 2 weeks before Kim's disappearance, Kim had pulled into a convenience store and flagged down Captain Simpson and another officer named Roger Griffin. So Officer Josh Griffin is the one who responded to the car stuck in the ditch. Officer Roger Griffin is actually Josh's father, and he was with Captain Simpson that night. So the report said that Simpson and his partner, Roger Griffin, had actually caught up with the car that was harassing Kim a little bit further down the road. There were two men inside the car, Eric Williams and George Connell, and they claimed that they thought Kim was actually the one harassing them by flashing her lights at them. And so to Simpson and to Griffin, it had seemed like a big misunderstanding, so the officers had just let them go. But Hulk, now looking at this through a very different lens, felt like he needed to speak to Eric and George regardless. And so in the report, he found the contact information for Eric and George, and he called them both up. But it turned out they both had airtight alibis for the night of Kim's disappearance. But even still, it struck Hulk as very odd that Kim had gone missing from her car on the same road at the same time of night and on the same night of the week as the road rage incident just 2 weeks earlier. And he had a hard time believing it was all just, one big coincidence. The next day, just after sunset on Sunday, March 30th, Hulk drove down Westwood Industrial Drive, a deserted dead-end street at the edge of town, about 2 miles from where Kim's Jeep was found. And as he was driving, he saw at the end of the street there were a couple of police cars parked there. And so he pulled his own car behind them, and he got out. He walked into the trees where he could see the beams of several flashlights moving around in the darkness. And as he got closer, he saw officers putting up police tape around a small clearing. And then, on the ground in that clearing, he saw a pair of feet in sneakers poking out from underneath a pile of roofing shingles and branches. The police had gotten a call earlier that evening from 2 men who were part of the community search effort for Kim. And they said to police that they had found a body in the woods in the spot, but they hadn't touched it. And so now with Hulk on the scene, the forensics team removed the shingles and branches that were covering the body, and Hulk pulled out his flashlight and knelt down to get a better look. And he saw right away it was a deceased woman, and it was definitely Kim Mrballen. She was only wearing a pair of shorts, a bra, and a sweatshirt that had been pulled up over her head. One side of her face was very badly beaten, and there were also cuts and bruises all over her neck, and there were some scrapes on her knees. And her necklace and wedding ring were still on, so her killer had not robbed her. Hulk stood back as the forensics team untangled Kim's sweatshirt from around her wrists so they could collect clippings of her fingernails, in case she had maybe scratched off a trace of her killer's DNA. And as Hulk watched one of these forensics officers go to put the sweatshirt inside of an evidence bag, he suddenly noticed something and shouted for the officer to stop. Hulk stepped closer and he shined his flashlight on the sweatshirt's fabric, and it revealed a shoe print. And so he told the officers to send that sweatshirt to the crime lab and see if they could figure out the size and type of shoe that had left that print. But while he would have to wait for those results, he knew he had a couple of other big clues to help narrow down a suspect. The first was the location of Kim's body. Westwood Industrial Drive was known as Lover's Lane, so basically a secluded, out-of-the-way spot where people often went to be alone. And the fact that Kim's killer had thought to take her there meant they were probably a local and familiar with the area. Now, it was still theoretically possible that she'd just been run off the road by some stranger for some reason, or, maybe a customer had followed her home from work, or maybe it was a blue light bandit impersonating a police officer. But the second big clue was that there was no sign of a struggle at Kim's Jeep. And because of that, Hulk did not think she had been kidnapped by a stranger. He thought it was far more likely that she had gotten out of her car for somebody that she knew and trusted. The very next day, Monday, March 31st, Hulk sat down in an interrogation room with his friend and first murder suspect, Kim's husband, Bridger. Bridger had been really pushy and really in some ways over-involved in the investigation from literally the moment Kim's Jeep was found. He'd messed with the crime scene by getting into the Jeep without permission, and now Hulk had information that Bridger had lied about his alibi. So when Kim first went missing, Bridger had told the police that he got home around 2:30 that morning, he called Kim for a brief chat a little before 3, and then he immediately went to bed. But now, a police officer had told Hulk that he had seen Bridger's black pickup truck driving around the center of town around 2:30 a.m., which was nowhere near Bridger's house, and nowhere near the route he would have taken to get back from his DJing gig. So once Hulk sat down, immediately he could see that Bridger was visibly distraught. I mean, he's just learned that his wife was found dead, but Hulk had a job to do. And so he cut right to the chase. And he said to Bridger that, hey, this other officer said they saw your truck driving around in town. It contradicts your alibi. Why did you lie? And right away, Bridger exploded. He was so mad. And he shouted at Hulk that he couldn't believe at a time like this, you would accuse me of lying to you? You're insinuating that I hurt my wife? I didn't do this. He also yelled at Hulk for just wasting time looking at him as a suspect when there were so many clues pointing to a different story, like the lack of a struggle at the Jeep and the rolled down window and missing driver's license, all of which made it look like a traffic stop gone wrong. Bridger said he knew Kim better than anybody, and she would never, ever get out of her car in the middle of the night for a stranger, especially after that road rage incident 2 weeks earlier. She was on edge. She never would have done that. When Hulk left the interrogation room a few minutes later, he told his team to track down security footage from around town on the night Kim was killed to see if there was proof that really Bridger was driving around when he said he was home. because right now they had no evidence to show he was lying, and they actually just had to let Bridger go. But when Bridger was leaving, he'd been so angry and so defensive, it sort of made Hulk think that maybe Bridger did this. And in fact, the fact that Bridger had brought up that his wife would never have gotten out of the car in the middle of the night for a stranger, well, that only reinforced that she might have gotten out of the car for you, Bridger, because she knew and trusted you. But also, Hulk was thinking that another person or group of people that Kim might have gotten out of the car for would be police. Now, Hulk already knew that there were no police that pulled anybody over that night, but somebody could have pretended to be a police officer, a blue light bandit. That was a theory that did sort of make sense. Hulk thought about that bulletin that had gone out over the police radio 2 weeks ago, telling officers to be on the lookout for Kim's Jeep at certain times of the night because of that road rage incident. Now, police radios were not private, so anybody with a police scanner could have been listening in, and what they would have heard is, well, around this time of the night, this woman, Kim, often drives this road all by herself. And they basically could have just been waiting for her, knowing she was vulnerable. So Hulk picked up his phone and he began calling around to other police departments in the region. And he actually found out there had been 2 separate reports of blue light bandits harassing women recently. Now, one of the culprits had already been caught, and he was in jail when Kim was killed, so it could not have been him. But the other suspect still hadn't been found. A couple of days later, on April 4th, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk slammed down the phone in frustration and crossed another name off a list on his notepad. It had been 5 days since Kim's body was found, and all the leads he'd had at the start of the investigation were now coming back as dead ends. When he tracked down surveillance footage from the night of Kim's disappearance, there was no sign of her husband Bridger's truck driving through town until 4 a.m., after Kim's Jeep had been found by police. So the officer who claimed to have seen Bridger's truck driving around at 2:30 did appear to have been mistaken, as Bridger said. Hulk also had reached out to Kim's manager and co-workers at the bar she worked at, thinking maybe her killer might have been a patron who followed her home. But none of them knew of any problems she had had with customers. Meanwhile, Hulk's team had spoken to a man who worked the night shift at a business that was near where Kim's Jeep had been found. He said he had left work a little before 3 a.m. on the night that Kim disappeared. And as he was waiting to turn onto Old Charlotte Highway, he had seen her red Jeep go past. And right afterwards, he saw another car that was going in the other direction make a sort of sudden, sharp 3-point turn and speed right after the Jeep. The man had said that this other car had lights on the roof and reflective tape on the rear, and he thought, or at least assumed, it was a police car, but he didn't get a good look at the markings. Now, Hulk knew that every single Monroe police officer that was on duty that night was accounted for, and they hadn't pulled anybody over at the time that Kim went missing. However, this new information certainly did support the theory that maybe Kim's killer was posing as a police officer, that they were a blue light bandit. So Hulk had spent the past couple of days trying to track down witnesses who had seen that other blue light bandit who was recently reported in a nearby town but had never been caught, but he kept coming up dry. Nobody knew anything that could help track down that suspect. So it seemed like the investigation was really starting to slow down. But then Hulk's phone rang, and he answered it, and it was an expert from the forensics lab who had just finished analyzing that shoe print that had been found on Kim's sweatshirt. And so Hulk leaned forward in nervous anticipation as the expert told him the results. And when he did, Hulk knew exactly how to find Kim's killer. Based on that shoe print, witness testimony, and other forensic evidence, this is what police believe happened to Kim Medlin on March 29, 1997. Around 3 a.m., the killer was driving down Old Charlotte Highway. They'd been prowling around for hours, pulling over young women for minor traffic infractions or sometimes for doing nothing wrong at all. And as they drove, they saw a familiar red Jeep pass by. The killer had seen that Jeep coming down this road several nights a week, and they'd sort of grown obsessed with the young blonde woman who was driving it. And now they decided it was finally time to do something about that. So they pulled an abrupt 3-point turn and raced after the Jeep and flipped on their car's flashing lights. Pretty soon, the Jeep pulled over onto the shoulder, and the killer got out of their car and walked up to the driver's side window. The woman inside naturally rolled down the window, and she handed over her driver's license, which said her name was Kim Medlin. And then she politely asked what the problem was, and the killer just told her to get out of the car. Now, Kim was visibly confused, but she did as she was told. And once she was out of the car, the killer slapped a pair of handcuffs onto her wrists and then dragged her over to their car and tossed her in the back seat. Then the killer got in the driver's seat of their car as Kim began crying and insisting that she didn't do anything wrong. Why was she being arrested? But the killer wasn't listening. Their mind was racing as they realized that even though they'd been dreaming about this moment for weeks, they actually didn't really have a plan for what they would do next. And so after a moment, they pulled over and just idled for a minute while they figured out what their next move was going to be. And then an idea came to them. They put their car in drive and continued down the highway. And as they turned onto a secluded dead-end road, Kim in the back seat suddenly got very quiet. And so the killer picked up on that and looked in the rearview mirror and saw her moving around, fiddling with something behind her back. And the killer suddenly realized that in all their excitement, they'd forgotten to lock the rear doors. The killer immediately tried to lock their doors with the power locks, but before they could, the rear door opened and Kim jumped out of the moving car. And so the killer came to a hard stop. They leapt out of the car and they ran back for Kim, who was lying in the middle of the road. Her hands are still cuffed behind her. And without even thinking, the killer lifted up their flashlight and they smashed it into Kim's head. And then they stomped on her back and broke her neck. But the killer wasn't done. They reached down and they put their flashlight around Kim's neck, basically put it up against her throat, and then they pulled back on their arms, basically creating sort of a noose around her neck with this flashlight. And they held it like that, and they pulled as tight as they could until Kim stopped moving. After that, they dragged her body off the road and into the woods, where they removed her handcuffs and covered her body with branches and debris to hide it. Then the killer went home and cleaned up their car, making sure there was no evidence that would tie them to the murder. But they didn't realize they had actually left behind one crucial piece of evidence at the scene, that shoe print on Kim's sweatshirt. The print had a very distinct V-shaped pattern on the tread, which made it very easy to identify. And so weeks later, the forensics lab traced that print back to a shoe that was made by the Thorogood Company, a supplier of military and uniform footwear. And that particular model happened to be the exact same shoe issued to officers in the Monroe Public Safety Department, which meant Kim's killer was not just posing as a police officer. They were a police officer. The killer was Officer Josh Griffin, the off-duty rookie cop who had responded to a car in a ditch about a half an hour before Kim went missing. It would turn out Josh had learned the details about Kim's vehicle and late-night driving patterns from his father, Officer Roger Griffin, after his father told him about that road rage incident that he and Captain Simpson had responded to on March 15th. And so Josh had basically been on the lookout for Kim's Jeep ever since. Josh Griffin was arrested on May 30th, 1997, about 2 months after Kim's murder. He was eventually convicted of first-degree kidnapping and murder and sentenced to life in prison. As for his motive, the best we can offer is he became obsessed with Kim and attacked her. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. In 1981, Maurice Doc Demetz was an 84-year-old man living in Colorado. He was a lifelong minister, had a PhD in theology. He also had a blood condition, and he had arthritis in his knees that made it almost impossible for him to walk without assistance. He had always been really passionate about topaz hunting. He would go to these sites where you could dig into the ground and look for these rocks. When you broke them open, you could potentially find topaz. And he loved doing that. Because of his knees and because of his blood condition, he needed someone to go with him, to walk him around to the different dig sites, and to help him get back into the car and drive him back to his house. Doc had a friend named David McSherry. He wound up being the primary guy that would go with Doc anytime he went topaz hunting. On April 29th, 1981, Doc decides he wants to go topaz hunting. So he calls up David, and they load up David's car, and they head off to Pike National Forest, which was a spot they had gone many times before. And they had this one area that they used to love going in particular called Devil's Head. Locals in the area claimed that that spot was actually haunted by evil spirits. But to Doc and to David, there was no indication that they bought into any of that, and they went there all the time. When they got there on April 29th at 10 a.m., they got out, they went to their favorite dig sites. David actually walked Doc down this hill to this one little clearing. Doc had a backpack with him full of the tools he used to dig out the different rocks. After David had walked Doc to this spot, David walked back up the hill towards their car and went about 50 yards away from where Doc was to his dig site. And over the next several hours, the two would work independent of one another, just digging for topaz. Periodically, David would look over and he'd make sure that he could see Doc and make sure Doc was okay. At 3:45 in the afternoon, David decides, all right, it's probably time to get going soon. And he pokes his head up and he looks in the direction of where Doc was supposed to be, and Doc's not there. He had just seen him about 15 minutes earlier, so he's not concerned. He knows it's only been a few minutes, and frankly, Doc can't really go anywhere. He can barely walk. And so he just kind of stands up and maybe tries to get a better look, and he's thinking, okay, maybe Doc stood up and got behind a tree to relieve himself, or maybe he kind of is just out of sight, and he starts walking down to the area to just go find Doc. But Doc isn't there, and neither is his backpack with all of his tools. And David's sitting there thinking, I guess Doc must have packed up and headed back to the car. But then David's thinking to himself, in order to go from this dig site up to the car, it means walking up a fairly steep embankment. And there's no way that Doc would have been able to do that without assistance. And so he's looking around the area thinking, is there any sign of something bad happening here? There's no blood. There's no sign of any sort of altercation that would have happened here. David certainly didn't hear anything going on near him. He didn't hear an animal attack or anything like that. So he thinks, okay, somehow he must have got up to the car. David walks up the embankment all the way to the car. Doc's not up there. David goes in the car and he starts honking the horn and yelling out for Doc. No response. As he's honking the horn, 3 motorists come down the road. They see David honking the horn, and so they say, hey, what's going on? David tells them, hey, I got my 84-year-old friend. I don't know where he went. He can't have gone far. Can you guys help me look for him? But after David and these motorists spend a couple of hours looking in this area and there's no sign of him, they end up calling the authorities. The police show up, and over the next week, there is this extensive search in this whole area that includes bloodhounds and hundreds of people. But despite this massive effort, nothing is ever found of Doc. He just vanishes. And so Doc's wife writes a letter to the governor of Colorado and just says, he can't have done this on his own. He can't have walked away on his own. Someone or something lifted him up and took him away. There was no response to this letter, and ultimately Doc's case was shut down. They stopped looking for him and assumed he had died. But when David Paulides looked into this case and featured the Doc DeMetz case on his documentary, they actually reopened the case. But as of right now, there's no new additional details about the whereabouts of Doc DeMetz. To this day, we don't know what happened to him. In 2014, Jim McGrogan was a 39-year-old medical doctor who was living in Indiana with his wife and his 2 kids. He was widely regarded as a very loving husband and devoted father, and everybody seemed to just love this guy. Jim was in phenomenal shape. He had run marathons, triathlons. He loved being in the outdoors, hiking, rock climbing, snowshoeing, skiing. That was Jim's happy place. And so in early March 2014, Jim decides he wants to plan a trip with some friends to go hiking in Colorado. And so he begins planning out where they're going to go hiking, and he finds this amazing trail right opposite the very famous Vail ski resort. Even though Jim was very competent in the outdoors, he would take a survival class and an avalanche preparedness class before he left for Colorado, just to show his wife that he wasn't taking any chances, that he would be well prepared in case the worst were to happen on this trip. About 2 weeks later, he's in Colorado and he heads to a ski shop where he rents a split snowboard as well as loads up on all the supplies that you might need for being in the outdoors. Early the next day, Jim and his friends arrive at the trailhead. Jim, in his backpack, had his cell phone, He also had an extra cell phone battery. He had a great GPS. In addition, he had loads of food and water. He had his split snowboard. He has his avalanche beacon. He's got extra clothing. I mean, this guy is well outfitted for this trip. So they start on this hike, and by 10 a.m. that morning, the rest of the group is feeling tired and wants to take a break. Jim doesn't want to take a break. He's in amazing shape and he wants to keep going. So he says, hey guys, I'm going to walk just a little bit farther up and I'll meet you at our next planned stop. No one bats an eye because Jim is like this total stud. He knows what he's doing. And they're like, all right, go ahead. We'll see you up there. Once the group is well rested, they stand back up and they keep walking. They get to that first stop and Jim's not there. They think, okay, we were sitting there for a little while. I'm sure he just went to the next planned stop because they had planned stops all along the route. The trail they were on, because it had snowed significantly that winter and lots of people had been on this trail, the trail itself was totally packed down to the dirt. So it was very easy to identify this trail. Anywhere there wasn't trail was covered in snow. And so if you were walking this trail, it would be really easy to stay on it. Also, if you were to deviate from the trail and start walking away, it would be really obvious because people would see your footprints leaving the trail. But as Jim's friends are making their way up this trail and not seeing Jim at each of these subsequent stops, they don't see any footprints leaving the trail. So they just figure he must have gone all the way to the end. He's just way ahead of us. But by 5 p.m., when they made it all the way up to the top where they planned on stopping and turning around, Jim wasn't there, and they hadn't passed him on the way up, and they hadn't seen any footprints or any ski tracks or anything to indicate that someone had left the path. And so very worried about Jim, they called the authorities. Over the next 5 days, a massive search is launched in this area, including 3 helicopters that scoured an 18-mile square radius. They had scent sniffing dogs out there. They had all these very experienced mountaineers combing the area, but they couldn't find any sign of him. And again, because of all the snow outside of that trail they were on, the helicopter just searched up and down that trail looking for indications that someone had left the trail, looking for those footprints or ski tracks just off that trail they were on, and there weren't any. There was no sign that anyone had left the trail at any point. Yet Jim was gone. The authorities, friends, family, everybody's baffled. But they're thinking to themselves, Jim's a really competent outdoorsman. He has a working GPS, and they checked their cell phones. That whole area they were in, they had cell phone reception. So they're thinking to themselves, we don't know what's going on, but I'm sure he's going to turn up at some point. 20 days after Jim went missing, his body is discovered by 2 hikers 7 kilometers away from the trail he had been on when he went missing. He had died from significant head trauma as well as a broken femur. It looked like he had fallen from a really great height, but it wasn't entirely clear where he had actually fallen from. He was found with just leggings and a shirt on, no jacket and no boots, and his boots were nowhere to be found. His backpack was next to him, and inside of it was his GPS that worked and his cell phone that worked. He even had an extra battery for his cell phone. Yet at no point had he tried to use his cell phone over the duration of the time he had been out there. He also had lots of food and water and additional clothing. He had a tent, but it looked like none of it had been touched since he packed it originally. And then strangest of all is there were no footprints or ski tracks leading up to either where he was or any of the surrounding areas. There were no tracks to show how he actually got where he got. It's as if he had been lifted off the trail 7 kilometers away and dropped where he was. When the exact location of where he was found was communicated back to the authorities, the helicopter pilots who had been involved in that initial 5-day search said that we looked at that area multiple times and he wasn't there. So at some point after those 5 days, Jim had found a way to land 7 kilometers away in this random place where there's no footprints that lead to it, no tracks, no anything. We know he had a working cell phone and a working GPS, and we know that he didn't make it to this spot where he ultimately was found in the first 5 days. So at a minimum, what was he doing in those first 5 days? Why wasn't he using his cell phone to communicate what was going on? Why wasn't he using his GPS to get back to safety? Why didn't he use the supplies in his backpack to save his life? Why did he take his boots off? And then how did he wind up in the location he was in? Because there was no tracks that would have led to that spot. In 1958, Bobby Bizup was a 10-year-old living in Colorado. He was almost completely deaf, so he wore a hearing aid, and he came from a family that was devoutly Catholic. That summer, Bobby's family decided to send him to a Catholic camp for boys. It was located at the St. Malo Church inside of Rocky Mountain National Park. The camp itself was situated at the base of Mount Meeker. Anytime the boys were up the mountain, which was pretty steep, they could always look down and see this camp. In addition, there was this stream that fed right by the camp. So if they could just get to the stream anytime they were up in the mountain, they could follow it all the way down and get back to the camp. This was something that they told all of the boys in case they got lost up in the mountain. On August 15th, around 6 p.m., Bobby was a little ways up from the camp, fishing along that river. And one of the camp counselors was making his way up to try to get all the boys to come back down for dinner. This camp counselor would say that he clearly saw Bobby recognize that it was time to come back down, it was time for dinner. He clearly saw Bobby turn and start walking down towards the camp. At which point the counselor turned his back on Bobby and he too began walking down towards the camp, which was not very far away. When the counselor got to the camp and turned back around though, Bobby was gone. And so the counselor starts immediately tracing his steps back to try to find Bobby, but he can't find him anywhere. The counselor goes and gets a number of the other counselors to come help him find Bobby. After about 30 minutes, no sign of Bobby. He's just gone. The camp counselors are looking around thinking, how is this possible? He was literally right there. He started walking. He was right behind me. How could he have gotten lost in such a short amount of time and in an area where he could literally see the camp and was actually on the river that leads right back to the camp? It didn't make any sense. The counselors alerted authorities and this massive search is launched to find Bobby. Over 300 people come out, including people from the military. It's this huge search and nothing is found of this boy. He's completely gone. 10 days after he went missing, they had to call off the search because there was absolutely no sign of this child. Even after the search ended, many of the camp counselors continued to, in their off time, scour the area around the camp to look for Bobby. And a year later, 3 camp counselors would actually find him. 3 camp counselors decided to go to a very hard to access area that had been searched previously, but they felt like it was the one spot that needed a little bit more attention. And it was 5 kilometers west of the camp and almost 800 yards up a fairly steep incline. This is a hard to access area, but they climbed their way up there, and sure enough, even though this area had been searched before, they found Bobby's hearing aid, bits of his clothing, and some of his bones. They didn't find any more of his remains, and no one knows what actually happened to him. But it really makes you wonder, what happened after the camp counselor turned his back on Bobby? It's as if someone scooped him up and flew him away. And even if he had intentionally run away, it would have been very difficult for a 10-year-old to get to that particular location where he was found. And to what end? Why would he have wanted to get up there? And so, like many of the other missing 411 cases, we are left with a series of questions and very few answers. So I'd love to get your theories as to what's causing these strange disappearances, and I'll do my best to get back to as many people as I can. So if you enjoyed today's stories, I would encourage you, if you have not already, to sneak into the Like Button's house and replace all of their family pictures with pictures of Steve Buscemi. Also, please subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly 3 to 4, even 5 video uploads. If you're interested in learning more about the missing 411 phenomenon, I provided links below to David Paulides and his team. If you have story suggestions for this channel, I have a subreddit called MrBallen. It's linked below in the description, and you can just drop your story suggestions right in there. If you want to get in touch with me.
On the evening of February 9th, 1993, a 45-year-old man named Harry Fuller drove down High Street in Wadhurst, a small village in East Sussex, England. Harry glanced out his car window and saw people walking into the shops and pubs that gave the village its charm, and as he did, Harry thought to himself how nice it would be if he just stopped right now and went into one of those pubs. But Harry knew he still had some work to do, so he kept on driving and grabbed his mobile phone, and with one eye on the road, he dialed one of his clients. Harry was a car salesman, but he didn't work out of a dealership. He specialized in buying cars at auctions and then resold them for a profit. And earlier that day, he'd seen a car coming up for auction soon that he thought he could sell to one of his clients. That client picked up on the other line, and in a big, excited voice, Harry went right into his sales pitch. When Harry was a child, he had struggled with reading and writing, so to make up for that, he developed his public speaking skills. His friends said Harry could tell a story like nobody else. and that gift for storytelling had served him well as a salesman. On the phone, Harry told his client that the car he'd seen was everything the man could ever hope for in a vehicle, and he painted a vivid picture of what it would feel like to sit behind the wheel. And within minutes, Harry knew he'd won this man over, and that there was going to be a big sale and a big commission in Harry's future. Harry told his client that he'd get the car when it came up for auction, and then he'd sell it to him for a very fair price. Harry reminded the client that he preferred to deal in cash. Then he said he'd be in touch soon and hung up the phone. Harry smiled. He couldn't wait to get home to tell his wife, Nicola, all about this very likely big sale he was going to close. A few minutes later, Harry reached the other end of High Street and arrived at the 3-story brick cottage he and his wife, Nicola, rented. Harry pulled around the back of the cottage, parked his car, and stepped outside. Harry and Nicola had only been living in Wadhurst for a few months, but they loved the home they'd found. It was next to a tea shop and close to several other stores and restaurants on High Street, but even more importantly for Harry, there was plenty of space behind the cottage for him to park all the cars he bought at auction until he sold them off. Harry opened the back door of his cottage, he walked inside, and called out for his wife. Nicola yelled back that she was upstairs in their bedroom. Harry made his way first to the front room of the cottage, and when he got there, he breathed in the smell of fresh flowers that always seemed to fill the house. Whenever Harry had a chance, he would buy flowers for Nicola and put them all over the house, because he thought that she should be surrounded by things that were as beautiful as she was. Then, after smelling the flowers, Harry walked upstairs to the large second-floor landing and headed down the hall into the bedroom, where he found Nicola getting ready to go out to dinner with some of her friends. When Nicola heard Harry come into the room, she walked over to him, threw her arms around his neck, and kissed him. And Harry kissed her back and told her about this big sale he was likely going to close. There were things about Harry's work that Nicola did not totally understand, but she knew he was always happy when he could sell a car, so she was happy for him. Then Harry took a step back, looked at the dress Nicola was wearing, and told her she looked absolutely gorgeous. Harry and Nicola had been married for about 6 months, and their friends and family said they already were the perfect couple. However, when they had first gotten together, some of those same friends and family did not think this. They thought maybe the couple would not even work. Nicola was 27 years old, almost 20 years younger than Harry, and while Harry loved to talk, tell stories, and meet new people, Nicola was the opposite. She was quiet and reserved. Her idea of a good time was sitting in her garden and maybe reading a book all day. But when her sister had introduced her to Harry, Nicola fell for the tall, older man with the long brown hair almost immediately. She thought Harry was charming and handsome, and she loved how confident he was. And when Harry met Nicola, he thought he'd found the woman of his dreams. She was smart and caring, and she was beautiful, with short brown hair, a great smile, and a sweet voice. Within just 2 months of dating, the pair got married. Nicola's parents worried she was rushing into this marriage, but after they saw how happy Harry made her, they came to love him just like she did. Back in their second-floor bedroom, Nicola put her hand on Harry's shoulder and steadied herself as she put on her shoes, and then she and Harry headed downstairs together. Nicola heard a car pull up out front. She looked out the peephole and saw her friend was waiting outside, so she gave Harry another kiss, told him not to work too hard, and then she headed outside. Once Nicola was gone, Harry sat down on the couch and thought again about maybe going out and grabbing a beer at one of the pubs. But before he could decide if he really wanted to do that, the phone rang. So he leaned over to the end table, answered the phone, and he heard his friend and insurance broker, Stephen Young, on the other line. Harry and Stephen talked briefly about a new business venture Harry was starting, and then at some point the conversation turned to golf, and then a couple of minutes later, Harry hung up the phone with Stephen, but he kept staring at the phone in his hand, wondering if maybe he should make one more work call before calling it for the night. Recently, a former business associate of Harry's had gotten angry at Harry because he believed Harry had cost him a ton of money. Harry knew this associate was not someone he should ignore or totally put off, but Harry just did not want to ruin his evening by calling this guy and arguing with him over the phone. So Harry just put the phone back and then settled back into the couch and decided to just avoid dealing with this problem for at least one more day. And later that night, after Nicola got home and she and Harry were lying in bed chatting, Harry made it a point not to talk about work. Instead, he and Nicola talked about an upcoming beach vacation they'd planned. Nicola said she couldn't wait to get away from the overcast weather in Wadhurst, and Harry said he was looking forward to spending time by the ocean with his beautiful wife and nothing else to worry about. And as Nicola drifted off to sleep that night, she thought about how just a year earlier she couldn't have imagined being so happy and so in love. The following morning, at around 8:30 a.m., Nicola stood in the kitchen on the first floor. She was wearing her nightgown, and she didn't feel fully awake yet. She opened a cabinet, took out a mug, and set it down on the kitchen counter. She poured herself a cup of coffee and added in a little cream and sugar. Then she pulled a cigarette out of a pack on the counter, lit it, and took a drag. Nicola loved having a few minutes in the morning to relax before she went to the shop in town where she worked part-time. She grabbed an ashtray, walked out of the kitchen, crossed through the front room, and walked upstairs to the second-floor landing. She sat down on the floor, stretched out her legs, and slowly drank her coffee and smoked her cigarette. Then she heard the front door open downstairs, and suddenly cold air blew through the house. Harry called out to say it was him and he was home, and she told him that there was coffee ready in the kitchen. Harry had just walked to a shop down the road to buy some cigarettes of his own, and he was now going to join his wife for their morning coffee before he started making work calls. But as Harry turned towards the kitchen, there was a loud knock at the front door. So he turned back around and looked out the peephole. Harry shook his head. He did not feel like dealing with the person on the other side of the door right now, but he knew he really had no choice. They were here right now. So Harry opened the door and welcomed this person inside. From the second-floor landing, Nicola heard Harry and this other person say hello to each other, but before she could even figure out who had come into her home, she heard a loud crashing sound coming from downstairs in the front room. Nicola put her coffee and cigarette down, got to her feet, rushed down the stairs, and looked into the front room of the house, and immediately she began to scream. 10 hours later, on the evening of February 10th, Detective Superintendent Graham Hill of the Sussex Police drove down High Street past a row of old brick cottages. Then he slowed down and parked across the street from Harry and Nicola's cottage. Hill glanced out his car window, and in the glow of the streetlights, he saw a crowd of local residents gathered nearby. He wasn't surprised by the scene, because police showing up in force to a cottage in Wadhurst was a very rare sight. Hill stepped out of his car. He was tall and thin with gray hair, and he wore a dark suit and tie. It was cold, so he could see his breath hanging in the air. So he quickly walked across the street, past the crowd of people, and went up to Harry and Nicola's front door. Earlier that evening, the Sussex police had received an urgent phone call from Nicola's parents. They said they'd been trying to reach Nicola all day, but they hadn't heard from her, and that a coworker had told them that Nicola had not shown up for work that day. Nicola's parents were worried because Nicola was not the type of person who would miss work without calling first. So the police had gone by the cottage just to make sure everything was okay, but nobody had answered when they knocked on the door. And then one of Harry and Nicola's neighbors said they had heard strange sounds coming from the cottage that morning. So the police had forced the door open and gone inside. And when they had stepped into the front room of the cottage, they knew instantly that something horrible had happened. So they had called into the station, and Detective Hill and the rest of the investigative team had headed over. Standing at the closed front door of the cottage, Hill turned around and looked back at the crowd of people staring up at him both right in front of the cottage and up and down High Street. Then he took a deep breath, turned back around, and opened the door, stepped inside, and shut the door behind him. Hill was a veteran of law enforcement, and it took a lot to affect him, but when he stepped inside of that cottage, he was shocked by what he saw. A large path of blood led from the front room towards the back of the house. So Hill followed the blood out of the room, down a hall, and past the kitchen. Then he stopped outside of the laundry room where the blood trail ended, and where several officers were now standing taking pictures. Hill stepped past the officers into the laundry room and looked down at the ground. Harry Fuller's body was propped up against the washing machine, and it was clear he had been shot to death. But as Hill looked at Harry, he noticed something strange. He crouched down to get a better look and saw there was white powder on the front of Harry's shirt. The placement of the powder seemed purposeful, like someone had sprinkled it on Harry after he was dead or dying. Hill thought the powder could be cocaine, but they would need to test it first to make sure that was true. Hill told a member of the team to collect samples of the white powder and then made his way back to the front of the house. He heard movement on the second floor, so he turned and began walking upstairs. and when he reached the second-floor landing, he saw a coffee mug on the floor next to a half-smoked cigarette in an ashtray and drops of dry blood leading down the hall. Hill followed this blood trail and eventually wound up in a bedroom where more officers were now gathered. On the ground in front of them was the dead body of Nicola Fuller. She was still wearing her nightgown with a duvet partially covering her. But the thing that really stood out to Hill was the blood-spattered phone lying right next to Nicola's outstretched hand. Just based on his first impression of the scene, Hill thought Nicola must have gotten away from her attacker after she had been wounded and had made it to this phone in the bedroom to try to call for help. That meant, for at least a moment, Nicola must have thought she might be able to escape the horror that was unfolding in her home. And the image of this poor young woman spending her final seconds terrified and desperately trying to save herself made Hill very angry. Hill took a deep breath and reminded himself to stay calm. Then he turned and headed back downstairs. Once down there, a ballistics expert who was crouched down in the front room waved him over. When Hill walked over to him, the expert showed Hill several bullets they had found on the floor. At first glance, Hill thought they just looked like standard .32 caliber bullets from a pistol, but the ballistics expert said there was something that made these bullets very unique. They had been manually altered to presumably cause as much damage as possible on impact. Hill knew his work was just starting, but the altered bullets and the white powder on Harry's shirt got him thinking that maybe these murders were tied to drugs. Whether the powder turned out to be cocaine or not, it seemed to Hill like the killer or killers had put it there on Harry to make the police think it was drugs, so that at least the first impression would be this was drug-related. Also, just the gruesome nature of the way in which Harry and Nicola were killed, with these altered bullets that totally ruined their bodies, it reminded Hill of some other incredibly violent drug-related homicide cases he and his colleagues had investigated in the past. But that was just an initial theory, and Hill would have to wait for test results on the white powder to know if it really was cocaine. But while he waited, he wanted to start digging into Harry's work to see if maybe he was not just a car dealer. Maybe his business included drug trafficking. So, in the days following the murders, Hill began looking into Harry's business practices. But he didn't find any links to the drug trade, and when the lab results came back on that white powder from Harry's shirt, it turned out just to be sugar. Hill didn't really know what to make of this revelation. He just knew that whoever had placed that sugar there had done so on purpose. It was a message of some kind. He just didn't know what it was. So Hill kept digging into Harry's business operations, and he started to get a much clearer picture of Harry's work and his personality. From interviews with work associates, friends, and people in town, Hill learned that Harry had earned the nickname Flash Harry because he loved flashy cars, flashy clothes, and flashing large stacks of cash around. Hill knew that the cars and clothes could just be part of Harry's larger-than-life persona that had attracted Nicola to him and had made him such an effective salesman. But Hill took notice when he heard a bunch of stories about Harry walking into pubs, reaching into his pockets, and showing off thousands of pounds, which is British money. Hill also learned that Harry would brag that the money in his pockets was nothing, and that he had tens of thousands of pounds in cash stashed away at home. And when police spoke to Harry's insurance broker, Stephen Young, he confirmed that Harry did most of his business in cash. Now, there was nothing necessarily illegal about that, but Hill knew people often used cash in business transactions just so they wouldn't leave any records behind. And so, the more Hill learned about how Harry operated, the more he became convinced that the murderer had to be someone Harry had done business with. And then, in late February, about 2 weeks after the murders, Hill discovered something that he thought might break the case wide open. Hill found out that weeks before the murders, Harry had unknowingly purchased a stolen high-end car at an auction to sell to a client. And when police had informed him that the car was stolen and pressed him for more information, Harry had eventually exposed another car theft operation in the area that he knew about. And he even pointed to a man he'd done business with, Roger Lee, as being the potential leader of that car theft ring. Police hadn't been able to tie Roger Lee to the car thefts yet, but they learned from people who knew Lee that he blamed Harry for costing him a lot of money, and Lee wanted revenge. Lee was the person calling the night before Harry was killed, who Harry decided to ignore and deal with another day. On a cold February afternoon, over 2 weeks after the murders, Hill dispatched one of his detectives to meet with Roger Lee to try to learn more about his connections to Harry. The detective left the station, and when he'd driven about an hour, he turned off the main road onto a narrow dirt road surrounded by huge green trees. The detective followed this road deep into the forest until it reached Lee's caravan, or trailer home. The detective parked in front of the trailer, stepped out of the car, and looked out at the woods. The surroundings made him feel uneasy, like he was in the middle of nowhere. Then he walked up to the trailer and knocked on the door. A few moments later, the door opened and Lee stared out at him. Lee was stocky with a wide face and dark eyes, and he had a reputation for being someone who admired the famous American mobster Al Capone. And similar to Al Capone, Lee had a reputation for threatening violence against anyone who stood in his way. The detective introduced himself and told Lee he just needed to ask him a few questions. And to the detective's surprise, Lee smiled politely and welcomed him inside. Once they were sitting down, the detective looked Lee in the eye and asked him if he knew a man named Harry Fuller. A huge grin immediately came across Lee's face, and he replied, "No comment." So the detective leaned forward and asked if Harry Fuller had played a part in shutting down a car theft operation that Lee was allegedly linked to. Lee grinned again and said, "No comment." The detective would ask several more questions and would get several more no comment responses, and so eventually the detective gave up for the day, headed to the door, and just told Lee not to leave town because they would be in touch. The news about Roger Lee not answering any questions annoyed Detective Hill, but it didn't change his mind about Lee's possible involvement in the murders. In fact, Hill still considered Lee a very important suspect, but he knew he would have to keep digging to find enough evidence to connect Lee to the murder if he wanted to arrest him and hold him for questioning. But as February came to an end, things started to run cold for the murder investigation. No murder weapon had been found, no fingerprints in the house had turned up anything useful, and nothing had been discovered that placed Roger Lee in Wadhurst at the time Harry and Nicola were killed. Hill was getting frustrated, and Nicola's parents were getting angry. They wanted action, and they wanted the person who had killed their daughter to be brought to justice. In mid-March, over a month after the murders, Hill and his team walked back into Harry and Nicola's cottage like they had done so many times over the last several weeks, hoping that this time they would find something they had missed, so maybe they could get the investigation back on track. Once inside, Hill began walking upstairs as the other officers he was with began searching the front room. But before Hill reached the second floor, he heard someone downstairs shout his name. So Hill quickly turned around and walked back downstairs and into the front room. And immediately, Hill felt a jolt of excitement when he saw one of the officers lying face down on the floor with their arms stretched out under the couch like they were reaching for something. Then that officer pulled something out from underneath, stood up, walked over to Hill, and handed it to him. It was a recording device that they had all overlooked every other time they had been inside of this home. Hill called over all the other members of his team who were there, and then he hit play on the device. Hill could feel the anticipation in the room. Then they heard Harry's voice, and the voice of another man, and they realized they were listening to both sides of a phone call. It would turn out, for several days right before he was murdered, Harry had begun using this recording device to record all of his phone calls. Police would never know exactly why Harry had done this, but Hill suspected it might have been because Harry was afraid someone was coming after him. And Hill still thought that person coming after Harry could be Roger Lee, the wannabe Al Capone. Over the following weeks, police began identifying and speaking with all the people who popped up on Harry's recording device. And as they spoke to each of these people, they learned nothing new. Finally, the police were down to just one more person on the recording that they had not yet spoken to. And the reason they had not spoken to them was because the police couldn't actually identify who it was. And so, after weeks of trying in vain to figure out who this mystery person was, Detective Hill finally just went on TV and played the recording with this mystery person's voice on it, hoping someone from the public might recognize it. On the night of April 15th, 1993, so not long after Hill had gone on TV, a woman and her husband, who lived in a town near Wadhurst, were sitting on their couch watching Crime Watch, one of their favorite TV shows. Crime Watch was a British show that featured details about active police investigations, and on the show, members of law enforcement and the host would ask viewers to help them identify someone who could potentially help a case move forward. On the couch, the woman and her husband watched as Detective Hill and the Crime Watch host introduced details about Harry and Nicola's unsolved murders. Then, Hill announced that he was going to play a recording of a phone call between Harry and an unidentified man, and Hill said learning the identity of this man could be crucial in helping police find Harry and Nicola's killer. The woman leaned forward on the couch and listened intently to the recording. Then, after it was done playing, a stunned look came across her face. She turned and looked over at her husband, and she said to him that the voice on that recording sounded exactly like his brother. Her husband shrugged and said, "No way, it can't be him." But then, Detective Hill on TV said they would play the recording again. So at this point, both the woman and her husband turned and looked back at the TV and leaned forward intently to listen as closely as they could. And when the recording played again, the woman stared at her husband knowingly. And finally, her husband breathed out a big sigh and said, "Yeah, that's my brother." The woman immediately got off the couch, she grabbed the phone, and she called her brother-in-law. And when he picked up, she told him what she had just seen on TV and said he needed to contact the police right away to make it clear he had nothing to do with Harry and Nicola's murder. After they hung up, this brother-in-law would immediately call the Sussex police to say that yes, he was the mystery caller. And when Detective Hill followed up with this brother-in-law and got more information from him, Hill would come to realize that he'd been totally wrong about the killer's motive. Based on conversations with this brother-in-law, who was the mystery voice on the recording, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, and evidence found at the crime scene, here is what Sussex police believe happened on the morning that Harry and Nicola Fuller were murdered, February 10th, 1993. Just before 8:30 a.m. on February 10th, the killer pulled their customized white Volkswagen car around the back of Harry and Nicola's cottage and parked it amongst the other cars that Harry kept back there. Then the killer picked up their mobile phone, called Harry, and told him they needed to talk in person. Harry said he was about to walk down the street to grab cigarettes, but he'd be home soon. So the killer stepped out of their car and walked to the side of the cottage where they could watch the street out front without actually being seen. The killer was calm and patient as they waited. Then, a few minutes later, the killer saw Harry walking down the sidewalk, and then he saw him go up to his cottage front door, open it up, go inside, and shut the door behind him. Once Harry was inside, the killer walked around to the front of the cottage and knocked on the front door. Harry eventually opened the front door, and the killer greeted him and stepped inside. Then Harry closed the door, and the two of them walked into the front room of the cottage. And while Harry was facing the other way, the killer took a quick breath, reached into their pocket, and pulled out a Walter PPK pistol, raised it, and fired. The bullet hit Harry in the back, and he crashed to the floor. Harry died almost instantly, but before the killer could make sure, they heard movement on the stairs. The killer looked up and saw Nicola come into view, and when Nicola saw Harry lying on the floor bleeding, she began to scream, and turned to run back up the stairs. The killer immediately raised the gun again and fired, striking Nicola in the shoulder. She stumbled forward on the stairs, but caught herself and got back up on her feet and kept going up the stairs. But when she turned around to see how close the killer was, she heard another bang and she felt a bullet graze her forehead. Nicola screamed as another round struck her in the cheek, cutting through her tongue and shattering the bones around her eye. Covered in blood, Nicola fell to her knees, but somehow she managed to drag herself up the remaining few stairs and down the hall towards her bedroom. The killer, who was still at the bottom of the stairs, just stood there in shock. The plan had been to kill Harry, not to kill his wife, and now the killer questioned what they had done and what they should do next. Meanwhile, Nicola had crawled all the way down her hall into her upstairs bedroom, where she pulled herself across the floor to the bedside table. She reached up, grabbed the phone, and dialed 999, the English number for emergency services. But when the emergency operator answered, Nicola couldn't speak because of the damage to her mouth and tongue, so she screamed, hoping that would be enough. However, the operator mistook her screams for that of a child who had mistakenly dialed 999, and so the operator began asking Nicola if she could please speak with her mommy. Nicola tried to talk again, but no words came out, so she just kept on screaming, and unfortunately, the operator just continued to assume that this was a child who had accidentally dialed 999, and so this was not a real emergency. Moments later, the killer wandered into the bedroom and shot Nicola in the head. As she lay dead on the floor, the operator, who had somehow not heard the gunshot, simply hung up and did not send police to the cottage. After partially covering Nicola with a duvet cover, the killer took several deep breaths to try to calm themselves down, and then they walked across the room to the dresser and opened the drawers. The killer dug through Harry's clothes and then finally found what they were looking for, an envelope with thousands of pounds in cash tucked away inside. The killer slipped the envelope into their pocket and then ran out of the room and down the stairs. Back on the first floor, the killer grabbed Harry's dead body under his arms and dragged him from the front room over to the laundry room and leaned him against the washing machine. Then the killer crouched down, reached into their pocket, and pulled out a plastic bag with sugar inside of it and sprinkled the sugar all over Harry's shirt. The killer then stood up, walked outside through the back door, and climbed into their car. Then they calmly drove to the insurance brokerage firm they owned like nothing had ever happened. It would turn out Harry's friend and insurance broker, Stephen Young, was the killer. When Young's sister-in-law had called him to say that she heard his voice on Crime Watch, Young went to meet with the police. The police had interviewed him early on and had not suspected him at all, so he assumed he could easily just go right back in, talk to police, and get himself cleared of any wrongdoing. But when Young talked to police this second time, he made a fatal error that quickly turned him into Detective Hill's primary suspect. When police had asked if Young owned a gun, he said yes, he owns several legally registered guns. But then, without prompting, Young also told them that he altered his bullets in his home workshop. Young made it sound like altering bullets was a money-saving practice, but this information made Detective Hill and his ballistics expert immediately suspicious because they had found altered bullets at the crime scene. So Hill felt like they had enough to get a warrant to search Young's home and office, and when they went to Young's house, they discovered a huge collection of weapons along with bullets that had been altered in the exact same way as the bullets found inside of Harry and Nicola's home. When they searched Hill's insurance brokerage firm, they found records indicating his business was in debt and in danger of going under. But a payment of £6,000 to a creditor had been made on the day following Harry and Nicola's murder, and that payment had allowed Young to barely keep his company afloat. It would turn out that the murders had nothing to do with the drug trade or Harry talking to the police about a potential car theft operation. Harry had just bragged about having lots of cash on hand to the wrong person. When Young had called Harry to discuss Harry's new business venture the night before the murders, this was the call that was heard on that recording, Harry said he had just secured a large investment in cash and he was holding on to the money. So Young murdered Harry to steal that money and save his own business. Nicola was never intended to be a target. Young killed her just so there would be no witnesses. As for the sugar that Young sprinkled all over Harry's shirt after he killed him, he had done that in hopes that the police would think it was cocaine and so would go down an investigative path that would not lead to him. Stephen Young was ultimately arrested and found guilty of committing the double homicide. He would be sentenced to 2 life sentences. However, this was not the end of the story. On March 22nd, 1994, the night before Stephen Young would be found guilty in court, 4 of the jurors in his murder trial were sitting together in an old wood-paneled hotel bar. All 12 jurors had been given rooms in this hotel for that night, but most of the jurors had gone to bed. However, these 4 had stayed up drinking and talking. The hotel they were staying in was hundreds of years old and had a reputation for being haunted. And so as they consumed more and more alcohol, the jury foreman, who was one of the four staying up late, suggested they go back to one of their rooms and host a seance to see if maybe they could contact one of the ghosts roaming the hotel's halls. So they left the hotel bar and stumbled upstairs to one of their rooms, and then once inside, the foreman grabbed a pen and several pieces of paper from the bedside table. Then he sat down on the floor and created a makeshift Ouija board, which is a board with the letters of the alphabet and the words yes and no on it that people will use to try to communicate with the spirits of the dead. When the jury foreman finished making this homemade Ouija board, he grabbed one of the hotel room's drinking glasses and placed it on the center of the board upside down. Then all four jurors sat down on the floor in a circle, and then each of them placed a finger on the top of this glass and then sat quietly waiting for instruction. The foreman called for complete silence, and then in a low, serious tone, he asked out loud if any spirits were present in the room with them right now. For a second, nothing happened. But right as the group was about to take their fingers off the glass and go to bed, the glass began to slide across the Ouija board and ultimately landed on the word yes. The jurors gasped and looked at each other and asked who had moved the glass, but they all said they hadn't done anything, so the glass must have moved on its own. Feeling excited and scared, the foreman asked another question. Who was the spirit in the room with them? And again, the jurors felt the glass begin to move under their fingers. This time it circled around the board, stopping on the letter H before moving to the letter A, then it slid across to letter R, and so on and so forth until it had spelled out the name Harry Fuller. The jurors laughed nervously when it was done, and again asked each other if any of them were moving the glass on purpose, but they all continued to say no. And so eventually, one of the jurors asked the apparent spirit of Harry Fuller who had killed him and his wife. The room fell silent again. Then, again, the glass began to move and spelled out the name Stephen Young. After it was done, the jurors pulled their fingers off the glass and just stared at the board. Then, after a tense moment of silence, they kind of nervously laughed again and decided they had had enough talking to the dead, and so they all got up and went to their separate rooms and went to sleep. The following morning, at breakfast with the rest of the jurors, the foreman revealed what he and the three others had done the night before. And for the most part, the jurors at the table thought it was a funny story. Later that day, the jury reconvened in court and found Stephen Young guilty of Harry and Nicola's murders, a verdict that law enforcement believed was clearly supported by concrete evidence. But then, in April, a month after the trial, one of the jurors who had learned about the Ouija board when the foreman told the story at breakfast sent an anonymous letter to the court explaining what had happened. And he said he could not live with himself if somehow a drunken seance with a Ouija board had somehow affected the guilty verdict. And when Stephen Young's attorneys were notified by the judge about this letter and about the seance, they demanded a retrial, and the court granted them one. And so a retrial with a new jury was conducted, but again, Stephen Young was found guilty and again sentenced to 2 life sentences. The legal outcome of the second trial was the same as the first, but any sense of closure Nicola's parents had found was shattered by the media frenzy surrounding the hotel seance. Nicola's father would say that the jurors had made a mockery of his daughter and son-in-law's deaths. And for years to come, the murders of Harry and Nicola would be remembered not for the tragic loss of life, but for the drunk jurors who tried to talk to the dead.
Early on the morning of January 12th, 1765, a 12-year-old boy named Jacques Portufis sat up suddenly in his bed, breathing hard. The room was pitch black that he was in, but he could feel he was sweating and his heart was racing, and he tried to shake his head to kind of wipe the nightmare he had just had from his mind, but he just couldn't do it. All he could think about was how in this nightmare, something had been chasing him, and he had been running for his life, and he was trying to get away, but whatever this thing was, this horrible beast that was following him, it just kept getting closer and closer and closer until it finally got him, and that's what woke him up. Jacques reached up and touched his face, and he realized he was crying, and he quickly wiped the tears away because he didn't want any of his brothers or sisters to see that he was crying.
Jacques was the oldest of 8 kids in his family, and all of them slept in the same small room on straw-filled mattresses inside of their family's little cottage in the southern French province of Gévaudan. And so, Jacques, he's looking around the bedroom to make sure none of his siblings had woken up and seen him in this state, and he was relieved to see that they were all still fast asleep. Everybody made fun of Jacques for being a scaredy cat, for being a coward. And to Jacques, this really hurt his feelings because on some level, he knew it was kind of true. In fact, just a couple of months earlier, he had lost in a physical fight with a much younger boy, and afterwards, Jacques had cried. And the whole town had seen this happen, and so afterward, all the kids began calling Jacques the wet chicken, and even Jacques' brothers and sisters began joining in and calling him the wet chicken and really making him feel totally ashamed. And it wasn't like the adults in this village were stepping up and protecting Jacques, because to them, Jacques was kind of like a liability. In this part of France, the winters were brutal. People died all the time in this village from the weather. And then the summers brought all these outbreaks of disease, which wiped out even more people in this village. And so by and large, where Jacques lived, it was kind of like the survival of the fittest. And many kids didn't live that long unless they were really hardy and tough, like their parents who had managed to survive for that long. But Jacques was just not like that. He was very gentle and peaceful, yet somehow he had survived. And Jacques really was not trying to become this kind of macho guy. Instead, he really wanted to be a priest, like his uncle. But his uncle lived far away, and so it was tough to see his uncle all that often, to learn about, how to become a priest. But anytime Jacques did get a chance to actually see his uncle, he would have a chance to read all these books and study alongside his uncle. And so for a little while, it was like Jacques was transported away from the hardships of his village to the life that in many ways he wished he had. A quiet, peaceful, very studious life. But deep down, Jacques felt like there was no chance he would ever actually escape this little village where he effectively was an outcast. Even though the sun had not risen yet, Jacques just sat on his bed and couldn't fall asleep again after waking up from this nightmare. And so just sitting there in the dark and the quiet, Jacques began to think about what he had to do later that day when the sun did come up. And, like usual, Jacques started to feel afraid. And so Jacques eventually just laid down with his eyes open, and he laid there until dawn, when one of his younger brothers, named Jean, who was 8 years old, rolled over and pushed him and said, "Hey, wet chicken, it's time to get up. It's our day with the sheep. Let's go." Jacques scowled at his younger brother and shoved him back, but not that hard, because Jacques never really shoved anybody that hard, no matter what they did to him. And then both boys hopped out of their bed. They wolfed down some bread and cheese and then headed out the door. As soon as they were outside, Jacques noticed that the village was much quieter than it normally was. But then again, these days, villagers did not leave their homes unless they absolutely had to. And so Jacques and Jean made their way away from their cottage down the dirt road to the pen where their family kept all of their sheep. And the boys opened up the gate and then used their staffs to kind of corral the sheep out of the gate back onto the road. And as the sheep kind of bleated and baaed and bumped into each other, the boys worked hard to kind of organize them on the road. And then once the sheep understood which direction they were going, towards the forest, a very familiar walk for the sheep, they kind of fell into line and just began walking very casually, like they knew exactly where to go. And once the sheep had fallen into this kind of routine rhythm, Jacques and Jean fell in behind them and just walked quietly after them. And as the boys walked, they both constantly kept looking left and right and ahead of the sheep and behind them, constantly scanning for danger, because they knew something was out here. For months now, children all across this province in France, Gévaudan, had been going missing. They'd go off into fields or pastures, like when they're moving their family's livestock around, and the kids would just vanish. And then sometimes, if they were found again, they'd be found totally mutilated far from where they should have been. The attacks on these kids across Gévaudan had begun a year earlier on June 30th, 1764. On that day, a 14-year-old girl, who actually was the older sister of one of Jacques' friends, had disappeared and then been found again later that day, partially eaten in a field near her home after she had not come home with the family's cattle. Now, of course, this was very tragic,
But to this point, there had not been any other attacks, so there was no pattern here, and so the assumption was she must have been attacked by a wolf, which did happen, and often 2 children, because kids at this time in France were often in charge of tending to their families' grazing animals, the way Jacques and Jean were going out with their sheep. These kids were small, they couldn't really defend themselves, and if a wolf set onto them, there was very little they could do. But 5 weeks after this 14-year-old girl was found dead and mutilated in the field, 2 more teenagers were also found mutilated and dead in a field. And really, this was only the beginning. As summer turned to fall that year, more and more kids went missing and then turned up dead in fields, partially mutilated. And the more these attacks happened across southern France, the more people thought to themselves, this can't be a wolf. Number one, wolves don't go on extended human killing sprees. That's just not a thing. And number two, if it was a wolf, they would be eating more of their victims. They wouldn't just rip their body to shreds and then leave them. They would eat the meat. And so by this early January day in 1765, as Jacques and Jean were setting out for the day with their family's sheep, the death toll from whatever was killing these kids was now well into the dozens. People in France had begun calling whatever was killing these children the Beast of Gévaudan, and stories about this creature began popping up in newspapers all over France. People all across southern France began forming these huge hunting parties to go out into the forests and the wilds of Gévaudan to find this creature and kill it, but they would always come back empty-handed. And then every now and again, a hunter would be out and they would see a huge wolf and they would kill it and they would declare that they had found and killed the Beast of Gévaudan. But the attacks on these kids all across this province just continued. So obviously that wolf was not it. And so as these attacks continued, all the fairs and festivals that normally would pop up all year long all across southern France, those all stopped because people were afraid to go out in fear of this creature. And then, of course, in villages like Jacques' village, people really just stopped going out unless they had to, again, because of the Beast of Gévaudan. But Jacques and Jean's family relied on their livestock, and they needed their sheep to go out and graze. And so, on this day in January, Jacques and Jean had to go out because their sheep had to graze. Their family relied on the sheep, livestock was their livelihood, and so this was a mandatory thing. And so, as Jacques and Jean continued walking behind their herd of sheep down this dirt road towards the forest, the 2 boys eventually came to a stop and just turned around and looked back at their village, and they saw walking on the road towards them were 5 more kids, along with 2 additional herds of sheep that these 5 kids were in charge of. Ever since the Beast of Gévaudan had become a thing, Jacques and Jean had begun tending their sheep along with these 5 kids and their sheep. They figured the bigger their group was, the safer they were from this creature. As the 5 kids got closer to Jacques and Jean, Jacques realized that one of the kids that was with them this day was a tall, thin redhead. It was the same younger boy who had recently beaten Jacques up in front of the village, and he had cried and everyone had made fun of him. And so Jacques sees this kid coming, and immediately he can feel his face burning with embarrassment. And then the boy, he sees Jacques, and he immediately smirks and begins flapping his arms like chicken wings. But once these 5 kids and their sheep joined Jacques and Jean and their sheep, they all kind of just went quiet, because none of them wanted to be out there. They were all scared of the Beast of Gévaudan, and the only reason they were together was, again, to be safe from this creature that was killing kids left and right. And so, in relative silence, all of the kids and their sheep just slowly walked together down this dirt path, and eventually they made it into the big forest, where just beyond the forest was the pasture where these sheep would graze. And as the group actually entered into the trees and it became dark and more quiet and kind of eerie, Jean actually tugged on Jacques' shoulder and said, "Will you please tell a story?" Because Jean was scared too. The kids were all scared, and they figured, if Jacques just told a story, it would take their mind off of how tense this moment was. And when Jacques heard this request, he actually smiled, because this was something he loved to do. He was a great storyteller. It was like his one strength. When Jean had asked for the story, the kids and the sheep had actually made it to really the end of the forest path. And so by the time Jacques was about to start his story, all the sheep had made their way out of the forest onto this big open pasture right in the middle of the forest. And so as the sheep just kind of filtered out into this open area, Jacques stopped and all the kids kind of came up right behind him. And Jacques started his story by pointing across the pasture to this bog that was right at the base of this big hill. And he said, "Do you see those big rocks in that bog over there? Well, you see the biggest rock? Well, that's not really a rock. It's actually a doorway. And if you move the rock underneath it, there's a portal to another world." And so as Jacques began telling this very creative story about this kingdom that existed underneath the bog, he sat down against a rock, kind of facing out towards the sheep, and all the other kids kind of filed in around him, taking seats, with Jean, his brother, sitting right behind him to his right. And Jacques, he was just really into the story to the point where he kind of forgot about what was happening with the sheep, and he wasn't scanning around for danger, and neither were any of the kids, including the redhead who had beaten Jacques up. He wanted to act like he wasn't into his story, but in reality, he totally was, and he was just as interested in what was going on with the magical kingdom below this rock. And finally, when Jacques got to the end of his story, where this evil giant that had been tormenting the kingdom under the bog had been tricked by an orphan to try to go through this magical portal into their world, and the giant had gotten stuck in the doorway because he was so big, and he never tormented the kingdom again, and they lived happily ever after. When Jacques got to that point in the story and all the kids are totally locked in and not paying attention to anything else, two things happened in rapid succession. The first was, even though Jacques is telling the story and focusing on that, in the back of his mind, he registers hearing the sound of twigs breaking somewhere right behind him, almost like the sound of someone or something moving along the forest floor. And the second thing that happened was the red-headed kid who had beaten up Jacques, without saying a word, just stood up and began sprinting towards the pasture. And for a moment, Jacques thought this kid, who was kind of like a bully, was doing this on purpose to be rude to Jacques, to kind of run away at the climax of the story like he didn't care about it. But then Jacques realized that he smelled something terrible behind him. But when Jacques turned around to see what was making this smell, he saw that his brother, Jean, who had been sitting right behind him to his right, was now gone, and where he had been sitting was just his staff laying on the ground. And for a second, Jacques just couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. He didn't understand how his brother could have gotten away from him without him noticing. But before Jacques could do anything, all the kids around him that were still there began screaming and pointing up towards this hill that was right behind them. And so Jacques turned around, and to his horror, he saw there was this huge 12-foot-tall creature that was covered in fur. It looked like an oversized wolf, but it was standing on two legs, and its bones seemed like they were too big for its own skin, and it made it seem very angular and jagged. And as it kind of loped grotesquely up the hillside, Jacques realized it was carrying in its front arm Jean, who was screaming and kicking, but could not get away from this creature. Jacques understood that this was the beast of Gévaudan, and it was going to go kill his brother. And immediately, Jacques is thinking, you gotta run away, get to safety, get out of here. And all the kids around him, that's what they did. They took off running towards the pasture. They didn't care about Jean, they only cared about themselves. And so Jacques, he knows he needs to get away, save himself, but his legs just will not move. He is rooted to the spot because something inside of him told him he has to save his brother. It doesn't matter if everyone thinks he's a coward. That's his brother. He needs to do something. And so Jacques, he turns to the kids who are running away from him, and he screams at them to stop, come back. And the kids were so surprised to hear this strong, authoritative voice coming out of the wet chicken that they did stop and turned around to see what he wanted. And he said, get over here, I have a plan. And so the kids, with the exception of the redhead who had run off by himself, they came back to Jacques, and Jacques began telling them his plan to save Jean. And the kids, again, were so taken with how Jacques was really owning this moment and being a leader that they all said, okay, let's do this. And so after this very quick planning meeting, all the kids turned and began running up the hillside towards the beast of Gévaudan, with Jacques in the front with his staff out. And the kids gained on the beast really quickly, And the creature clearly noticed and kept turning around and kept looking at these kids getting closer and closer, but the beast did not seem interested in any of them. It just wanted Jean. And in fact, it moved Jean from its arm up into its mouth, and then the creature began kind of using the trees to pull itself faster and faster away from the kids. But Jacques, he just kept going faster and faster and pushing himself to get closer and closer. And as he did, it motivated the other kids to follow along and push it and gain on this creature. And finally, they got close enough to this beast that Jacques yelled out to the kids, "Now!" And they all fanned out around it and began smashing this beast with their staffs they used to shepherd their livestock. Now, none of their blows to this creature were doing any real damage, and the creature did not really seem fazed that the kids were now attacking it, but they were kind of able, with their strikes to this creature, to direct it and get it to kind of turn in the direction that Jacques had told them to make the creature go. And so the kids continued to beat and poke and corral this creature, and every time they'd hit it, the beast would kind of flail out with one of its arms, but it never really did anything because, again, it's really focused, obviously, on taking Jean. But eventually, Jacques' plan worked. He had corralled the creature to the top of the hillside, right over where that bog was, where those rocks in the middle were part of the story that Jacques had told about how there was this portal to another world. And once this creature was positioned where Jacques wanted it, he again yelled to the kids to do the next phase of their plan. And all the kids kind of fanned out to the top of the hill, and with their staffs, they beat and poked this creature down the hill into the bog. And as they did this, Jacques kept looking to see if Jean was alive, because earlier he had been screaming and kicking, but now there was blood all over his brother, and he was limp in the creature's mouth, and he wasn't making any sound. But Jacques didn't care. He wanted to get his brother back, dead or alive. And so finally, Jacques stepped forward from the group, and he wound up and he smashed the beast as hard as he could, hard enough that the beast actually kind of stumbled forward into the actual marshy bog. And what Jacques knew about this bog and why he had come up with that particular story about there being a gateway to another world is weeks earlier, he had actually accidentally stepped into this bog and saw it was really deep. And he had been lucky enough that he had grabbed a rock and kind of pulled himself out, because if he hadn't, the bog kind of functioned like quicksand. You could get stuck in the bog and never get out again. And this is what happened to the beast of Gévaudan. It went feet first into the one spot of the bog that Jacques had had all the kids corral it to, that was the deepest and most dangerous part. And as soon as the beast stepped into it, it sunk down to its waist. And immediately the beast reached out with its huge muscular arms and tried to pull itself out of the bog, but it couldn't. It was stuck. And so in its panic, it let go of Jean from its mouth, and it actually turned around, and it looked at Jacques and the other kids. And when it did, Jacques almost lost his nerve, because when he saw this thing face to face up close, he saw this was not a wolf's face. This was almost like a human face. Its eyes were making distinct eye contact with Jacques, and it was furious. It was like the beast understood that Jacques had just trapped it. He had tricked the beast into walking into this bog, and it wanted to kill Jacques. And for a moment, Jacques was totally entranced by this creature's eyes. It just struck him that this looks human. It looks intelligent. What is this thing? And while Jacques was kind of in this daze, the creature reached forward and slashed his stomach wide open, and Jacques fell backwards on the ground, but luckily he was far enough away from the beast that he couldn't be pulled back in. And in this kind of frantic moment, one of the other kids saw an opportunity and ran forward, grabbed Jean, who was laying on the surface of the bog, and he pulled him away from the beast. And the beast whipped around. He tried to grab Jean, but he couldn't. And so all of a sudden, all these kids were safely away from the beast of Gévaudan, who was totally trapped. And so at this point, the other kids who were not hurt, they scooped up Jacques and they scooped up Jean, and they began running away from the bog across the pasture back towards the village, leaving the beast where it was. And as they ran, they heard it bellowing out and roaring and trying to pull itself out, but it still just remained in the bog. And finally, as they got back to that dirt path that led back to the village, they saw there was a group of armed villagers running towards them, because it would turn out the redhead who had ran off, he had told the village, and they were coming out to help the kids. And so as the armed villagers met with the kids, they told them where the beast was, stuck in that bog, and the villagers took off to go kill the beast. And then the kids, along with Jacques and Jean, they went into the village. They were put into a home and put on beds, by which point the village doctor had come over and began treating both of them. Jean was alive, but just barely. He had lost a lot of blood, and the beast had grabbed onto his scalp and really crushed his skull, but he would ultimately survive. As for Jacques, it was a very painful wound that he had sustained on his stomach, but none of his internal organs had been damaged, and so he would also survive as well. As for the armed villagers, even though they very quickly got out to that bog where the beast was, when they got there, the beast was gone. And the beast of Gévaudan would continue to kill people for another 2 years, until June 19th, 1767, when a hunter happened to encounter it in the middle of a forest, and he shot and killed it. And by that point, over 100 people had been murdered by this creature. The hunter would drag the carcass of the beast back into his village, and a doctor would perform an autopsy, but the doctor was unable to identify what kind of animal it was. It did kind of look like a wolf, a really huge wolf, but its body was just so misshapen and its bones were too big, and it clearly walked on 2 legs, not on all 4s, and so there was never any definitive information about what this even was and how this even happened. But when they opened up its stomach, they did find human body parts. Jacques was one of the only people to have ever survived an encounter with the beast of Gévaudan, and so he was celebrated all across France. And he quickly went from being the wet chicken to the little hero, and his story would reach as far away as Boston, Massachusetts. And in fact, Jacques' story was so well publicized that it eventually reached King Louis XV, and he was so moved by it that he invited Jacques to come meet him, and after meeting Jacques, he loved him and offered to pay for his entire education. And so Jacques would get to finally leave this little village where he never quite fit in, and he would move to northern France and enroll in a prestigious school there, and he would spend his days reading and writing just like he had always hoped for.
Streetlights dripping gold on your skin. Every look feels like a sin. We don't talk about tomorrow now, just breathing in the here and now. Windows down, let the moment ride. City moving at our side. I don't need a map tonight. Your smile's got me losing time. Every second getting closer. No brakes pulling me over. Heartbeats in the city. Running wild, running free. If this night's a memory, make it unforgettable to me. No rules, no pity, just you right next to me. We're louder than the doubts inside. Heartbeats in the city.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events. But we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.